So today is Monday, March 9, 2026. And for you, the learner listening to this custom-tailored deep dive, we are recording this just over a week after an absolute geopolitical earthquake.
Yeah, earthquake's really the only word for it.
Right, because on February 28, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was assassinated in this massive daylight airstrike. And the materials we've curated for you for this dive, they are just extensive.
They really are. I mean, we are pulling from deep historical profiles, psychological and sociological autopsies.
Which are fascinating, by the way.
Totally. Plus, these encyclopedic breakdowns of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and highly detailed analytical models of Iran's nuclear posture, their foreign policy, all of it.
Exactly. So whether you are stepping into, a high-stakes board meeting and trying to anticipate how global markets will absorb this massive shock, or you're simply trying to comprehend the sheer scale of the 2026 Iran war unfolding right now, this deep dive is going to give you the definitive, nuanced picture.
Yeah, because the breaking news alerts, they've already saturated the airwaves with the basic facts, right? Everyone knows he's dead. But our mission today goes way beyond just reporting the event.
We're bypassing all that standard newsfeed noise.
Right. Our objective is to actually deconstruct the man himself, to understand the massive architecture of the state he built over nearly 4 decades, and to examine the granular details of Operation Epic Fury.
The strike itself.
Exactly. And from there, we'll unpack the ripple effects, what analysts are calling a Berlin Wall moment for the Middle East.
A Berlin Wall moment. I love that framing. So to understand this colossal apparatus of the Iranian state as it exists, or I guess existed in 2026, we have to start with the psychology of the architect.
Right, you have to look at the origins.
And looking through these historical profiles we have, the roots of that psychology trace back to 1939 in the holy city of Mashhad.
Yeah, and we should clarify, this was not a childhood of privilege or vast political influence.
No, not at all. The family had moderate religious standing, sure, but the economic reality was stark. The accounts in the sources consistently use this specific phrase, bread and raisins, to describe their daily sustenance.
Bread and raisins, it really paints a picture. And the environment in that household, it was defined by an immense, almost suffocating religious rigidity.
His father was strict, right?
Fiercely strict. He was a deeply traditional religious scholar. And the biographical data we're looking at highlights a deeply ingrained punitive structure in his upbringing.
Yeah, I read the accounts of the physical beatings.
Exactly. There are documented accounts of his father subjecting him to physical beatings simply for mispronouncing words during Quranic recitation.
Just for mispronouncing a word.
Right. And when you look at that through a psychoanalytical lens, you really begin to see the formation of a worldview where adherence to sacred text is absolute.
And any deviation is met with immediate, severe physical consequence.
Exactly. It implants this profoundly binary understanding of right and wrong, authority and submission very early on.
So that binary worldview, it seems to have perfectly primed him for the environment he stepped into as a young man. Because by 1958, he crosses paths with Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini.
And this is where the anti-colonial struggle becomes the absolute defining purpose of his life.
Right. He fully immerses himself in the revolutionary underground, fighting the Shah's regime. Over the course of the 1960s and 70s, he is actively hunted by the Savak.
The Shah's notorious secret police?
Yeah, and he's arrested 6 times. He endures brutal torture. He's forced into internal exile.
And the psychological autopsies point to this exact period as the crucible. Because a lesser ideology, or a different person, might have fractured under the weight of repeated Savak interrogations.
But for Khamenei, it was different.
For him, the suffering validated the ideology. It cemented this belief that he was part of a righteous vanguard enduring a trial by fire.
But there's this crystallizing moment, right? The event that foreign policy analysts really focus on when building his psychological profile.
Yes, it happens a bit later, in 1981, just after the Islamic Revolution had overthrown the Shah.
Okay, so set the scene for this, because it's wild. He's serving as president of the newly formed Islamic Republic.
Right, and he's at the Abuzar Mosque in Tehran giving a speech to a crowd. And there's a tape recorder sitting on the desk right in front of him.
Just a standard tape recorder.
Exactly. But it had been rigged with explosives by the MEK, which was a militant dissident group violently opposed to the new clerical establishment.
And the bomb detonates point blank.
Point blank. He survives the blast somehow, but the injuries are catastrophic. The assassination attempt leaves his right arm permanently paralyzed.
Permanently paralyzed. And how does that affect his psychology?
Well, political scientists utilize this framework known as operational code analysis to model how leaders perceive the political universe.
Right, how they process information and make decisions.
Exactly. And under this framework, Khamenei is the quintessential wounded survivor. He didn't view that paralyzed arm as a vulnerability or a weakness. He integrated it into his persona as a living testament to his sacrifice for the revolution.
It became a physical manifestation of his legitimacy.
Absolutely.
And that wounded survivor mentality, it seems to have fused with the broader national trauma unfolding at the exact same time. I mean, the 1980s were defined by the horrific, grinding attrition of the Iran-Iraq War.
Right. So you have the psychological synthesis of surviving a personal assassination attempt while simultaneously presiding over a war that consumed hundreds of thousands of Iranian lives.
Which forged his doctrine of defensive realism.
Yes. His perception of the international system was fundamentally Hobbesian. He believed the political universe was inherently and aggressively hostile.
So he categorized global actors into that strict binary we talked about earlier.
Exactly. The arrogant powers, primarily the United States and Israel, and the oppressed. And in this paradigm, the arrogant powers weren't simply political rivals. They were existential threats dedicated to the eradication of the Islamic Republic.
Which completely changes how you interpret diplomacy or international pressure. I mean, if you view the world through that lens of defensive realism, economic sanctions aren't leveraged to bring you to the negotiating table.
No, the sanctions, the diplomatic isolation, the covert sabotage, all of it merely confirmed his preconceived victimhood narrative.
So, when Western administrations applied maximum pressure, they were assuming a rational actor model, right? Where economic pain forces political compromise.
Right, but Khamenei's operational code rejected that entirely. For him, yielding to pressure was not a strategic concession, it was ideological suicide.
Resistance was the core of his identity.
To compromise with the arrogant powers was to abandon the very justification for his survival.
Wow. Okay, so the dossiers present this image of an unyielding, almost monolithic ideological fortress. But here's where it gets really interesting. There's a detail in these profiles that totally subverts that expectation.
With full literature.
Yes. The hardline cleric, the architect of this brutal resistance doctrine, was profoundly devoted to secular Persian poetry and classic literature.
He would host these intimate private gatherings with poets.
And his favorite piece of literature, the book he revered above all others according to the sources, was Mikhail Sholokov's Russian epic, And Quiet Flows the Dawn.
Yeah, that literary preference is essentially a master key to his self-perception. Because And Quiet Flows the Dawn is this sprawling, tragic narrative centered on a Cossack protagonist.
Right, a protagonist who is fighting this desperate, brutally violent war to protect his people.
To protect his people, his culture, and his homeland from being obliterated by the sweeping, merciless tides of history and revolution.
And Khamenei saw himself in that.
He identified with it intrinsically. He did not read that book as a casual observer. He saw himself as that tragic guardian. In his mind, he wasn't an authoritarian dictator suppressing his populace. He was the solitary sentry standing at the gates.
Holding back the overwhelming forces of Western cultural and political imperialism.
Exactly. Forces that he felt threatened to wash away the soul of his nation.
That self-image of the solitary guardian defending the nation, it becomes incredibly relevant when you look at the mechanics of how he actually ascended to the position of supreme leader.
Because the historical record shows he was never supposed to be the guardian.
Right. So let's fast forward to 1989. Ayatollah Khomeini, the charismatic founder of the Republic, passes away. And the system is thrown into an immediate, severe succession crisis.
Because the man who had been groomed for the role, Grand Ayatollah Montazeri, had been systematically sidelined.
He was placed under house arrest, wasn't he?
He was, because he publicly condemned the regime's mass execution of political prisoners in 1988.
So the political establishment is left staring into a void.
And there was a massive constitutional problem. The Iranian constitution at that time explicitly required the supreme leader to be a marja.
A grand ayatollah.
Right, possessing the highest level of recognized religious authority and scholarship in Shia Islam.
But Khamenei did not possess that rank.
Not even close. He was a Hajjatul Islam, which is just a mid-level cleric. He simply didn't have the theological credentials to inherit Khomeini's mantle under the laws of the very republic they had built.
So the assembly of experts, the body tasked with choosing the successor, suddenly has to square the circle. They have a political insider who is fiercely loyal to the hardline revolutionary principles, but who is constitutionally disqualified from taking the job.
So the solution they engineered is often referred to by historians as a constitutional miracle.
Though looking at the sources, it was more of a raw exercise of political power.
Oh, absolutely. They hastily convened, rewrote the Constitution, and entirely stripped away the requirement that the supreme leader must be a marja.
They just changed the rules.
They lowered the theological threshold to allow a recognized Islamic scholar with strong political and administrative capabilities to assume the role.
So Khamenei was elevated to the highest office in the land, not by divine mandate or unmatched religious scholarship, but by political contortion.
And a move like that leaves a permanent scar on a leader's mandate. You know, he's sitting on the throne, but the entire clerical establishment in the city of Qom knows the rules were rigged to put him there.
Which means he had this underlying deficit of religious legitimacy.
And that deficit haunted the first decade of his rule. Because he couldn't command the unquestioned spiritual authority that Khomeini wielded naturally, Khamenei had to construct an impregnable fortress of hard political, military, and economic power.
He engaged in a systematic campaign to marginalize the founding elites of the revolution who might challenge him.
Concurrently, he completely restructured the financial lifeblood of the clerical establishment. He channeled massive state resources into the seminaries in Qom.
Effectively turning independent religious scholars into state dependents.
Exactly. He ensured that the promotion and funding of the next generation of clerics were tied directly to their personal loyalty to him.
But co-opting the clergy was really just one pillar. The true architectural marvel of his reign, the mechanism that ensured his survival and projected his power, was his transformation of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
The IRGC.
Right. And the IRGC started in 1979 as a relatively scrappy ideological militia meant to protect the new regime from a military coup. But under Khamenei, the scale of what the IRGC became is difficult to overstate.
The encyclopedic accounts in our stack detail a parallel state structure that completely dwarfs traditional government ministries.
Just the military dimensions alone are staggering. The sources map out a force of 190,000 active-duty personnel operating completely independently from the regular Iranian army.
They possess their own ground forces, their own naval arm that aggressively patrols the Persian Gulf.
And an airspace force that commands the entirety of Iran's vast ballistic missile program.
And beyond the active-duty troops, they oversee the Basish,
which is this sprawling paramilitary volunteer network,
capable of mobilizing upwards of 600,000 personnel at a moment's notice for internal security and ideological enforcement, right down to the neighborhood level.
But the military footprint is only half the story, right? The sources detail how Khamenei deliberately engineered the IRGC into an economic leviathan.
Yes, utilizing a conglomerate known as the execution of Imam Khomeini's order, commonly referred to as the CTOD.
And the valuation of this entity, this is the part that blew my mind, is estimated at over $95 billion.
$95 billion.
And it answers exclusively to the supreme leader. It operates entirely outside the purview of the Iranian parliament or the national budget.
Through the CTOD and a labyrinthine network of IRGC-affiliated front companies, the guards methodically consumed the commanding heights of the Iranian economy.
They dominate the banking sector.
Telecommunications, heavy manufacturing, massive infrastructure projects.
They control the commercial shipping lines and the major ports.
And when international sanctions targeted the formal Iranian economy, the IRGC simply monopolized the illicit black market smuggling networks.
They controlled the flow of goods in and out of the country. They basically created an environment where it became practically impossible to conduct large-scale business in Iran without enriching the military apparatus directly loyal to Khamenei.
And that economic stranglehold created a massive structural contradiction within Iranian society.
Because on one hand, you have this incredibly wealthy, highly militarized state apparatus pushing an ideology of fierce self-reliance.
Right. In 2019, Khamenei released a sweeping manifesto titled The Second Phase of the Revolution. He directed it squarely at the youth, demanding they build a glorious new Islamic civilization.
Emphasizing resilience against the arrogant powers and projecting an image of a unified, ideologically pure society.
But the dissonance between that manifesto and the lived reality of the Iranian population was deafening. While the regime championed resistance culture, the citizenry, particularly the youth, were being crushed under the weight of severe stagflation.
The economy was trapped in this brutal cycle of skyrocketing inflation and stagnant growth, heavily exacerbated by systemic corruption and international isolation.
So you have this incredibly educated, digitally connected youth demographic, utilizing VPNs to bypass state censorship, observing the global community.
And realizing they are trapped beneath an ideological glass ceiling imposed by octogenarian clerics.
The pressure from that dissonance inevitably boiled over into the streets, and the response from Khamenei's state apparatus was consistently ruthless.
The sociological analyses track a steady escalation of state violence. In 2009, during the Green Movement protests over a disputed election, the Basij were deployed to violently suppress demonstrators.
Then you fast forward to 2022, the Woman, Life, Freedom uprising sparked by the death of Gina Mahsa Amini in police custody. Security forces utilized lethal force against unarmed civilians, resulting in hundreds of deaths.
And the data from early 2026, just weeks before his assassination, points to some of the most brutal crackdowns in the history of the Republic.
Khamenei formally branded widespread youth protests as a foreign-orchestrated coup d'etat, which provided the ideological justification for massacres in the streets.
So the internal dynamic was one of perpetual friction and suppression. To understand how he managed to maintain equilibrium and justify the existence of his highly militarized state despite that domestic turmoil, we have to look at his foreign policy architecture.
Which international relations theorist describe as a three-level game?
A three-level game. Break that down for us.
Sure. When navigating the global stage, he wasn't simply dealing with the adversary across the negotiating table. He was simultaneously balancing three distinct constituencies.
Okay.
First, the foreign powers he was engaging or opposing. Second, the deeply divided domestic factions within Iran, which ranged from hardline IRGC commanders to pragmatic economic reformers.
And the third?
The internal political dynamics of the adversary nations themselves. He was acutely aware of how foreign policy could be leveraged to outmaneuver domestic rivals and unify his base.
And the primary instrument for executing that three-level game was the Quds Force, the elite external operations branch of the IRGC. Through them, Khamenei constructed the axis of resistance.
Right, which was not a traditional alliance of nation-states. It was a sprawling, highly sophisticated network of non-state proxy militias, armed, trained, and funded by Tehran.
Including Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, an array of powerful Shia militias in Iraq, and the Ansar Allah, or Houthi movement in Yemen.
The strategic utility of that axis was immense. It allowed Iran to project hard power across the entire Middle East, establishing a land bridge to the Mediterranean and securing leverage over critical maritime choke points.
More importantly, it operationalized his defensive realism. By equipping these groups, Khamenei could wage a continuous shadow war against Israel, a state he fundamentally viewed as an illegitimate occupier.
And bleed American resources in the region, all while maintaining a layer of plausible deniability that insulated Iranian soil from direct conventional military retaliation.
That shadow war really defined the geopolitical landscape. But the ultimate flashpoint, the issue that consumed international diplomacy for the last 2 decades of his life, was Iran's nuclear program.
Yes, the nuclear fatwa. The sources provide a highly detailed breakdown of this religious ruling issued by Khamenei regarding nuclear weapons.
The evolution of this fatwa is a fascinating study in statecraft and religious authority. The earliest murmurs of a religious prohibition appeared in the mid-1990s as private correspondence.
But it was crystallized into major public declarations in October 2003.
And subsequently enshrined in a formal presentation to the International Atomic Energy Agency in August 2005.
The text of the fatwa categorically declared that the production, stockpiling, and use of weapons of mass destruction, specifically denoting nuclear, chemical, and biological armaments, constituted a grave threat to humanity and were strictly haram.
Absolutely forbidden under the tenets of Islamic jurisprudence.
Now, the analytical community is sharply divided on how to interpret that fatwa, and our source materials lay out 2 profoundly different frameworks for understanding its intent and durability. I want to make sure we cover both impartially, just looking at what the analysts argue.
Right. On one side of the spectrum, you have analysts like Gareth Porter, writing in foreign policy journals, who argue for the deep historical sincerity of the prohibition.
Their framework anchors the fatwa in the visceral trauma of the Iran-Iraq War.
The historical context they cite is critical here. During the 1980s conflict, Saddam Hussein's forces deployed massive quantities of chemical weapons against Iranian troops and civilian populations.
The casualty figures from that were horrific. An estimated 20,000 Iranians killed and upwards of 100,000 enduring severe lifelong injuries from nerve agents and mustard gas.
The pivotal argument from this perspective is that despite possessing the capability and facing an existential threat, the Iranian leadership deliberately chose not to retaliate in kind with chemical weapons.
So analysts utilizing this framework argue that this historical restraint demonstrates a profound, culturally embedded moral aversion to indiscriminate weapons of mass destruction.
Exactly. They view the fatwa not as a temporary political maneuver, but as a rigid religious doctrine aligning with Islamic traditions that explicitly forbid warfare tactics, resulting in the mass slaughter of non-combatants.
Okay, so that's the sincerity argument. But the opposing analytical framework, which is heavily prevalent in intelligence assessments and think tanks based in the United States and Israel, views the fatwa through a completely different lens.
Yes. They interpret the declaration not as a binding moral absolute, but as a calculated strategic deception rooted in specific theological concepts.
Like the concept of taqiyya.
Right, the Shia Islamic principle of taqiyya, which permits the concealment of one's true beliefs or intentions when facing severe persecution or imminent threat.
Analysts like Michael Eisenstadt and Mehdi Kalaji argue that the fatwa was deployed at a moment of intense international scrutiny and pressure.
Designed specifically to diffuse tensions and protect the regime's infrastructure from preemptive military strikes.
Furthermore, they emphasize this overriding principle in the Iranian governing structure known as Mashhad,
which dictates that the absolute survival and expediency of the Islamic State supersedes all other considerations, including established Islamic law.
They point to historical precedents where Ayatollah Khomeini abruptly reversed deeply entrenched religious rulings on taxation and women's suffrage when political survival necessitated it.
So under this framework, Khamenei's fatwa was infinitely flexible, a theological shield that could be instantly discarded the moment the supreme leader determined that a nuclear deterrent was required to guarantee the regime's survival.
And if you track the rhetoric of the Iranian leadership in the years leading up to the 2026 conflict, it shows a distinct erosion of that prohibition. The tone shifts dramatically.
In 2021, the Minister of Intelligence, Esmail Khatib, delivered a highly publicized warning.
The cornered cat quote.
Yes, he stated that if the international community continued to isolate Iran, pushing the state into a corner like a desperate cat, the regime might be forced to alter its strategic calculus and pursue a nuclear deterrent.
The internal pressure to abandon the fatwa accelerated visibly. Intelligence intercepts and public posturing from February 2025 indicated intense lobbying from senior commanders within the IRGC,
urging Khamenei to formally rescind the ban and militarize the nuclear program in response to escalating regional hostilities.
And then by March 2025, Adil Larijani, a prominent advisor to the supreme leader, explicitly stated that Iran would have no choice but to cross the nuclear threshold if its facilities or sovereign territory were subjected to a direct attack by the U.S. or its regional allies.
And that escalation brings us directly to the precipice of the current crisis, the 2026 Iran war.
The context here is key. The entire Middle East has become a kinetic battle space, with the axis of resistance fully mobilized. Amidst this chaos, Khamenei adopts a posture of extreme paranoia.
Following the intense engagements of the 12-day war in June 2025, he completely withdraws from public view.
He relocates to a heavily fortified bunker complex situated beneath his official residence in central Tehran.
The engineering specifications of that bunker underscore his absolute terror of precision-guided munitions. The subterranean facility was buried so deep into the bedrock that the specialized elevator required to access his level took more than 5 minutes to complete its descent.
5 minutes just in the elevator. He believed he had constructed an impenetrable fortress, isolating himself from the reach of the arrogant powers he had battled for decades.
But the Central Intelligence Agency had been painstakingly mapping his communication nodes, his courier networks, and his operational patterns.
The intelligence apparatus identified a critical vulnerability. A rare gathering of the regime's senior command structure was scheduled to occur, and Khamenei was confirmed to be attending the meeting within the above-ground compound of his official residence.
The window of opportunity was established. The joint operation between the United States and Israel, designated Operation Epic Fury, was authorized.
February 28th. 2026. The execution of the strike shattered every assumption about regime security.
This was not a clandestine drone operation conducted under the cover of darkness. It was a massive, overwhelming daylight assault directly in the heart of the Iranian capital.
The telemetry data from our sources indicates that Israeli fighter squadrons penetrated Iranian airspace and deployed a payload of 30 advanced munitions.
Heavily utilizing the Blue Sparrow air-launched ballistic missile system.
30 bombs. The kinetic impact was catastrophic. Satellite reconnaissance immediately confirmed that the compound was reduced to pulverized concrete and twisted rebar.
And the immediate aftermath was defined by a profound information vacuum and the intense fog of war. The narrative control fractured instantly.
Within hours of the strike, U.S. President Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu held press conferences announcing the successful elimination of the supreme leader,
framing the operation as a definitive victory against state-sponsored terrorism.
Conversely, the Iranian state media apparatus went into absolute denial, desperately attempting to project stability. State-run outlets like the Islamic Republic News Agency and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued furious rebuttals.
They broadcast continuous loops of archival footage, assuring the populace that Khamenei was safe and sound, having been relocated to an undisclosed secure facility.
Semi-official news agencies like Tasnim and Mehr published statements insisting that the supreme leader remained steadfast and firm in commanding the field.
The dissonance between the international declarations and the domestic propaganda created an atmosphere of excruciating tension across the country.
The dam of state propaganda finally collapsed in the early hours of March 1. The Supreme National Security Council, broadcasting across all state television and radio networks, delivered the stark confirmation: Khamenei was dead.
And the official casualty list released by the Fars news agency revealed that the strike hadn't just decapitated the state, it had decimated his immediate family and inner circle.
Alongside the supreme leader, the blast killed his daughter Hoda, his son-in-law Mesbah Bagheri Khani, his daughter-in-law Zahra, and 3 of his grandchildren.
And the devastation compounded the following day, March 2, when it was announced that his wife Mansoura had succumbed to severe trauma sustained during the bombardment.
The societal reaction to the official confirmation exposed the deep, irreconcilable fractures within the Iranian populace.
This sociological data from the days following the strike presents a nation experiencing 2 entirely different realities simultaneously.
In the conservative strongholds, the grief was overwhelming and visceral. In Mashhad, thousands of loyalists converged on the Imam Reza shrine.
The footage reveals scenes of mass hysteria, individuals collapsing, weeping, and physically striking themselves in mourning.
At the Jamkaran Mosque, the authorities hoisted the red flag,
which is a deeply symbolic Shia tradition, signaling an unequivocal call for blood revenge. For the ideological base of the regime, the anchor of their universe had been violently torn away.
But the footage emerging from other sectors of the country told a story of explosive, uncontainable catharsis.
In major urban centers like Tehran, Isfahan, and Shiraz, vast crowds flooded the streets in jubilation.
In the western city of Dailaran, citizens were documented physically tearing down a massive statue of the supreme leader, cheering as the bronze monument smashed into the pavement.
However, the state security apparatus, though leaderless, remained lethal. Anti-riot units and plainclothes Basij militias deployed into the celebrating crowds, utilizing live ammunition. The celebrations instantly morphed into violent street clashes.
Amidst the macro-level geopolitical analysis, the troop movements, and the casualty reports, there is a micro-narrative within the source material that perfectly encapsulates the staggering resilience of the Iranian civilian population during this exact moment.
It centers on a man named Bahman, who operates an independent bookstore in central Tehran.
The accounts of Bahman's bookstore provide this incredible grounding perspective. The city is subjected to subsequent airstrikes. The power grid has failed across multiple districts. The regime built over 40 years is violently disintegrating around them.
And yet Bahman refuses to lock his doors.
He lights his shop with dozens of candles. He posts updates on the few social media networks still accessible via VPNs, inviting anyone caught in the chaos to come inside. He spends the night serving tea to terrified strangers taking shelter among the bookshelves.
That scene, strangers huddled together by candlelight, drinking tea while the architecture of a militarized theocracy burns outside, is profoundly evocative. It represents a fragile, enduring human intimacy, completely detached from the violent ideologies warring above them.
The sociological commentary notes that Bahman's simple assertion, "We're alive, we still have tea," serves as a more profound act of defiance and continuity than any slogan chanted by the regime or its adversaries.
It grounds the entire geopolitical crisis in the reality of the 88 million Iranian citizens who are just trying to navigate the fallout.
And then as we record this on March 9, 2026, the political reality those citizens are waking up to is unprecedented. The assassination has triggered an immediate existential succession crisis.
The absolute authority Khamenei wielded has vanished overnight.
And the mechanism the regime has chosen to fill that vacuum is steeped in historical irony. The very foundation of the 1979 Islamic Revolution was the violent rejection of hereditary rule.
The absolute repudiation of the Shah, passing the nation to his son as if it were personal property.
Yet, facing the collapse of their system, the Assembly of Experts convened an emergency session yesterday, March 8, 2026, and officially appointed Mojtaba Khamenei, Ali Khamenei's son, as the new supreme leader.
They have essentially mutated the republic into a clerical monarchy.
The elevation of Mojtaba immediately exacerbates the severe internal fractures within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The command structure is no longer unified under a charismatic founding figure.
The intelligence assessments highlight a dangerous schism developing within the IRGC high command. On one flank, you have the radical ideologues, many of whom have deep, long-standing operational ties to Mojtaba.
This faction views the assassination as an intolerable humiliation that demands apocalyptic retaliation.
They are advocating for a massive escalation, leveraging whatever remains of the axis of resistance to strike directly at U.S. and Israeli assets, regardless of the consequences.
On the opposing flank, you have the pragmatic realists within the military-economic complex. These commanders recognize that the Quad's force network has been severely degraded, the domestic economy is in total freefall, and the streets are boiling with insurrection.
Their priority is shifting entirely to internal regime survival, calculating that a full-scale conventional war against the United States will end in the complete annihilation of the state apparatus.
The outcome of that internal power struggle within the IRGC is not just a regional issue. It is dictating the trajectory of the global economy as we speak.
The immediate market reaction to the succession announcement and the internal instability has been violent. Global crude oil prices have surged catastrophically overnight.
The commodities markets are pricing in the very real, terrifying possibility that a fractured, desperate IRGC might execute their long-standing contingency plan: the closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
The strategic geography of the strait cannot be overstated. It is a narrow maritime choke point between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman.
Approximately 40% of the world's seaborne crude oil, along with massive quantities of liquefied natural gas, transit through that specific waterway.
If the radical factions within the IRGC utilize their anti-ship missile batteries and naval mines to blockade the strait, the disruption to the global supply chain would be instantaneous and devastating.
We are looking at the potential for energy prices to double or triple within weeks, triggering rampant inflation across Western economies,
paralyzing industrial production in Asia, and highly likely forcing a massive direct military intervention by a coalition of global powers attempting to forcibly reopen the shipping lanes.
The decisions being made in Tehran right now have the capacity to fracture the economic stability of the entire globe.
The velocity of these events is staggering.
It really is. In the span of this deep dive, we have traced the arc of a man who began as a young cleric subjected to poverty and torture in Mashhad. We examined the psychological trauma of a bomb tearing through a tape recorder, forging a doctrine of defensive realism that viewed the world as inherently hostile.
We broke down the constitutional maneuvers that placed him in power, the subsequent construction of a $95 billion state within a state under the IRGC, and the proxy networks utilized to wage a shadow war across the Middle East.
And we analyzed the catastrophic climax, Operation Epic Fury, the deployment of Blue Sparrow missiles that obliterated a heavily fortified bunker, wiping out his inner circle and plunging a deeply fractured nation and the global economy into totally uncharted territory.
It is a stark demonstration of how rapidly the foundational structures of global geopolitics can be rewritten.
We want to thank you for dedicating your time to this deep dive, moving past the superficial breaking news alerts to genuinely comprehend the complex historical, psychological, and economic architecture driving today's headlines.
The speed at which this deeply entrenched system is currently unraveling leaves us with a critical question to consider as the events of this week unfold. We have spent considerable time analyzing the external force applied to the regime, the sophisticated intelligence gathering, the advanced ballistic missiles, the devastating precision of the foreign airstrike that pierced a subterranean bunker. But as Mujtaba Khamenei attempts to consolidate power over a newly minted clerical monarchy, facing a population crushed by economic despair and raging against the state, does the ultimate existential threat to the survival of the Islamic Republic actually come from the kinetic impact of those foreign munitions? Or does the true mechanism of its destruction stem from the complete, irreversible evaporation of the original 1979 revolutionary ideology within the hearts and minds of the very people it claims to govern?